Hi, I'm thrilled to be back again on LinkedIn with a conversation about innovations that we're having at work. And honestly, those are really needed because we're dealing with a lot of very challenging situations now. COVID cases are rising, restrictions have been easing. But now in other places, restrictions have been put back in place. There have been pauses in openings up in different states. So the business climate is extraordinarily uncertain, and we're not quite sure how to move forward, whether people should be coming back into the office, how we should actually be running our businesses. So I have a solution here in terms of design thinking. Design thinking is a very powerful way to be looking at your business afresh and looking at it with new eyes to think about how you can move forward differently, because we're dealing with such unusual circumstances which look like they can continue to move forward in a very uncertain way. So I have with me today Huang, who is a futurist and a designer and the co-founder of a design venture called FUSA. And without further ado, I am going to introduce LaShawn and welcome, LaShawn.
Hi, Sophie, and hi, everybody on LinkedIn.
So please, LaShawn, please just introduce yourself. What does being a futurist in the design field mean, and what does FUSA do, and more about the design world, and so that we can sort of lead into how that's going to help people think about the future and how design thinking can help.
Great. Well, thanks again for having me here. As you already mentioned, I am a co-founder and creative director of FUSA, which is a design and social innovation consultancy based in New York, but we've worked all over the world, ranging from working with the Genocide Memorial in Rwanda to update that museum and memorial experience for genocide survivors, to working with international organizations, with diplomats, with business people in Fortune 500 companies. And it's centered around design thinking, as you mentioned before, but also a futures practice. And so to unpack what that means, design thinking is a method and a mindset that starts with an understanding of human needs and motivations to not just solve problems by creating new products and services and programs, etc., but also to look at different possibilities. So it's really about possibility seeking as well, which is where the futurism piece comes in, is that we've probably done fire drills before. I used to live in Japan where we did earthquake drills. And so you're preparing for potential things that will happen. And so with this futures thinking, we are not necessarily trying to predict, because nobody has a crystal ball that works, but what are some possible and plausible futures? What are some of these preferable futures that allow us and our organizations to prepare for them? And the idea too is that if we can't imagine something, we can't design it, we can't make it real. So how do we make things concrete? How do we engage with the aesthetics of things to really look at, what does the future of work look like in terms of a day of the life in the workplace, or continuing to work from home, or whatever that looks like?
So LaShawn, in terms of before, I have been saying recently that, the COVID-19 restrictions really changed the situation. The future work is here now. How have you been looking and thinking about the future of work up until, let's say, March, so that we can really understand what has changed and how you have been thinking differently about the future of work and how to apply design thinking now? But what did it look like for you before, and how was design thinking able to help businesses anticipate what was ahead? And how they were sort of prepared based on some of the things that you'd been showing them up until this point.
Yeah, so even before the COVID shutdowns, there's a question that I ask my clients and my students a lot, which is basically, what would you do if your primary revenue driving product or activity dried up, or it went away, right? So if you're in higher ed, you're not able to give in-person classes anymore, or if you're a restaurant, you can't host guests indoors. So all of these things that before in these workshops and strategy sessions seems kind of like a real pain in the butt kind of question of like, why is he even asking this? This is sort of beyond the pale. But when we have a shakeup and a disruption like COVID, then a lot of these eventualities have become real. And so a lot of what we're looking at in terms of design thinking and futures thinking for organizations that want to innovate is thinking about what are new behaviors, what are sort of new cultural norms within your organization, because often the first obstacle is not necessarily an external one, right? So obviously there are constraints in the market and in consumer behaviors and all of these sort of things, but a lot of innovations sort of die before they're even articulated by somebody because you're self-censoring in a meeting, or you think your colleagues aren't going to even entertain an idea that's preposterous. And I think part of the learning opportunity in this very unfortunate and very serious COVID crisis is that a lot of organizations are realizing now that they do have to go there. And, you know, to borrow from politics, there's this idea of the Overton window, right? Of the things that you can mention in an organizational culture, in a political culture, and still be taken seriously. And now that everything is being shaken up, it is about how do you start with these conversations so you can move forward.
It's very helpful in thinking about that. And so now that we are trying to think very differently, and what I see is that there seem to be a lot of companies that were really trying to get through the lockdowns, sort of hunker down, try and get through it, and then things would go back to normal. But obviously they're not. And with the second waves, with the continuation of climbing cases, I think there's a much more of a realization about what the changes are that we're going to have to be dealing with, for months to come. So how can design thinking, how can people sort of look at their businesses and think about, whilst they still trying to keep everything going, as they move forward on a daily basis, how can they stop and look at this, very, very differently, and use, the concepts that you're talking about to think about things that are so out of the ordinary? Where do you start?
Yeah, I know I kind of started out with a big swing talking about, shattering the institutional Overton window and thinking about what are these sort of norms and regular expectations of business as usual that have gone away. But there's another part of design thinking, which is actually about managing risk, right? We've heard of this term too big to fail, but this is really about too small to fail. So when we think about the process of design thinking, it's really not that different from the scientific method, right? You have some sort of hypothesis. You think, okay, maybe consumers will want this, or maybe this will have deliver some sort of value to our customers. And then you prototype something. So we often think about prototype as like the suckier version of the real thing. But there's different ways to prototype. There's look and feel kinds of prototypes where you're really looking at like the shapes and the real structures of something. But there's also functional prototypes and situational prototypes that are more looking at like how something fits into somebody's life, right? Or testing for whether or not somebody would pay for something. And so how do we make these small bets and kind of move those forward in an iterative way? And so it's also about shortening our cycles, right? Thinking about how do we not necessarily still think about the long term, but also think about, okay, what can you do in a week or in a month in a small sprint to experiment or change a small thing, and then see if you can measure any sort of change that's positive. And even if it's not a good positive change, what doesn't work, right? So that's still managing risk in a way.
Right. But also at the same time, there also are companies that have needed to make monumental changes, at least, really take a sort of fork in the road for the time being. I mentioned to you that there's this amazing company in Australia that was making stages. That was their business. They made stages for the theater. And when COVID came, all the theaters were shut, and so they actually looked at what they had. They had wood, they had carpenters, and they started making furniture.
Right.
So it reminds me of that amazing, you told me a great designer joke, which was, how many designs does it take to make a light bulb? Please tell me the answer.
So the answer is, does it have to be a light bulb, right?
Right.
And
So, I love that. So if a company, because are some companies like that stage the theater stage making company that really have to think incredibly differently. And unfortunately, very unfortunately, right now there are a lot of businesses that have to make some fundamental rethink fundamentally to try and work out what they can do to get through the months ahead. How, give us an example or two in terms of how people can think about it. What can they do, and examples that you have or stories that you have to share with us.
yeah, well, kind of in my circles in the world that I know, I recently caught up with a grad school classmate who runs a company in Los Angeles that does basically like light shows and video screens for live events, right? So you go to a big concert and they do all of this sort of light projection and things that are on the screens. And obviously, because concerts and these massive live events aren't happening right now, his entire business dried up overnight. But again, similar to the theater people in Australia that you were talking about, because they essentially had a fab lab, right? A space where they could do light manufacturing. They were able to get an exemption to stay open and then convert their production to making masks and other supplies that are COVID related pretty quickly, right? In a matter of days. Now, not everybody has sort of easily convertible light manufacturing facilities to do this sort of thing. But if we look at other examples, right, I'm sure in quarantine, a lot of us have spent a lot of time watching Netflix. And if you look at Netflix over the last few years, right, going from this DVD in the mail model to a streaming model, but also investing in production of original shows, the value proposition and the mission has stayed the same for Netflix, but they haven't been tied to any given technology or medium or even way of doing business. And so thinking about that, both kind of giving the micro example of my friend's company, but also these macro examples of large companies that have been thinking about delivering value, but in very different ways, and thinking about what can you give up to open up new possibilities.
Got it. Okay. So in terms of if a business is thinking right now, trying to identify, so the core really is to try and identify what the value is that you're providing to customers. And that might change as well, right? Because, also if I think about some of the businesses and that maybe you had customers who are mostly focused in Texas and in California, right now they may not be ready to buy. And so it's also a question of trying to understand and think through, where am I providing value, and what is the value that I can provide now, and for the sort of near term, I guess.
Yeah. I think there's also something about moving quickly, right, and being able to pivot quickly in this sense, as you were saying about different regions, right? So in the restaurant hospitality sector,
Right.
it's been great. I moved out of New York City for the shutdown and was living on Eastern Long Island, and just being able to get Gold Belly or other delivery of foods that I missed from the city. And so thinking about expanding beyond your neighborhood or your typical geographical reach as a company, right? And how do you plug into that because these services are so available these days? And then I think there's something to think through too about like what is that value, or how do people's needs change over time, right? So if we stick with hospitality and the restaurants, like people still need to eat. So we've seen restaurants turn into like little general stores or turn into sending meal kits that are kind of semi-arranged at home. So thinking about, again, in that smaller scale compared to Netflix, but how do you rearrange and unbundle and rebundle some of these forms of value that you're delivering to your customers, and also thinking beyond your typical geographical reach.
That's very interesting when you talk about unbundling, because I think that's one of the things that we have talked about in the past in terms of understanding how your business works and what the workflow is, and really sort of unpacking it to understand what the different pieces of value and how you're servicing customers and how you're actually completing your work. Because you're talking as well to me about it's not just about how the business works, but it's also design thinking can be applied to how you yourself work, right?
Yeah, so I teach a design thinking class, continuing ed class at the Parsons School of Design. And one of the activities I have my students do is do a journaling activity where they're basically chronicling some aspect of their daily routine, right? Whether it's how they get ready in the morning or how they feed their kids. And taking that step back, because often we're in autopilot in our daily lives, right? So thinking about, okay, what do you really do from step to step here? What are your decision points? What are your pain points? And then once they map this out, and this is just, a matter of a flow chart kind of thing, then I ask them, where are the opportunities for design intervention, right? And design interventions can mean different things. It doesn't always have to be like an app or some sort of specific piece of technology or even like a hardware gizmo, right? It could just be something pretty simple, right? Like classic example is like for people who want to work out more, if you put your gym clothes next to your bed or by your front door, you're much more likely to do that. So these small changes that can change habits. So I have students start with the personal there. And then because so many people have been working at home, I also have people redesign their workspaces, right? We don't always have access to the same equipment and gear that we could get in an office. I'm talking to you right now with my laptop on a shoebox stacked on a book, right, to get it at the right height. So we're kind of jerry-rigging these things, and it's really about, not replacing professional interior designers, obviously, but tapping back into that almost like childlike wonder, right, of playing with your Lego blocks and unlearning some of these things of like, okay, well, like, to do it, you have to do it right and you have to do it scalable. But when you're starting with yourself and your own space, like what are things that you can do today just to see if something works, and then you can figure out a more long-term sustainable solution later.
I love the idea. I have written and talked about unlearning. I love that as a concept because I think there are so many things that we have been doing that haven't been great for us and that haven't been really helping us do our best work and perform at our best, and also healthy habits and things like that. So sort of unlearning, I think severe disruption as we're experiencing right now can be helpful to help us unlearn what we have been doing and start with more of a clean state. And I love the idea of that sort of childlike wonder. How have you seen some of the people that you've been talking to and teaching, which I'm sure you've pivoted to be doing online? How have they been changing? Because obviously, their work habits and work situations, because obviously in New York, you have an extraordinary range of people and obviously, people who went out to different places, got out of the city during the peak. What did you experience, and what were some of the surprising changes that people saw?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one change, maybe not surprising, is parents who have kids at home all of a sudden all the time, right, have had to design not just like a home office setup for themselves, but some sort of sustainable solution for their kids as well. I have a coworker who has young kids, and she and her husband are both working at home, and so they've been able to coordinate, essentially having different shifts, right, where they trade off, but still in their apartment space have to share basically a one-room office, right, and then take the kids elsewhere. So we've seen that. And then back to the idea of unbundling and repackaging things. My online class was online years before the COVID shutdown. So in some ways that was relatively straightforward because I had already been doing that. But for some of my in-person classes that I was teaching in the spring, that was an interesting transition because we often take a bundle of value for granted, right? So when you're teaching a college class in a classroom, yes, I'm sometimes lecturing and delivering information, but it's also other things, right? You're creating community. You have a sense of peer support or healthy competition among students for different design projects. There's a sense of motivation. So there's all sorts of things that you get from just being in a classroom, being in the room where it happens. And you can't translate that one-on-one to Zoom, right? It's like, I think it's often a reductive and simplistic thing to say like, oh, well, let's just pre-record the lectures or do a lecture on Zoom and assume that that's the same thing. We have to think about, okay, classroom education is this whole bundle of things. How do we replace the community building aspect, the peer-to-peer aspect, right? The getting to class 5 minutes early, talking to your neighbor, getting to know each other. All of those things do not happen in Zoom. So how do we replicate those in different ways? And so I've seen some interesting things around just like virtual happy hours and smaller, kind of more social things to complement what's going on.
Yes, and it seems that there are more capabilities and more people being innovative about how to use breakout rooms. And I saw one thing which was about how to, if you make every single person a co-host, then, and you do breakout rooms, they can actually, everybody can move through the breakout rooms as though it's kind of like a cocktail party or a workshop. I think the technology has been a little clunky in some of these things, but it is, we're using more of the capabilities to understand how we can duplicate some of those things. One of the things that you said earlier to me, which really struck me, was about sort of intuition and being much more purposeful and explicit. And that was sort of one thing that design think, and I'm sorry if you can hear anything, but there's thunder going on outside where I am.
I'm hearing it too outside.
You're hearing it too? Okay, fine. But it's quite loud. So in terms of how people can be, you know, how they've been working and how they've been conducting their lives and trying to be productive, but really getting very explicit and clear about what they're doing and how can they, you know, what are the steps to take to get away from the intuition or what you're just sort of, you know, doing and really think much more clearly and specifically about how you can set yourself up for success personally and professionally within the organization.
Yeah, I think this is actually linked to your previous point about facilitation and the breakout rooms. So I taught a class on facilitation at the School of Visual Arts in the spring, and it was a very rapid transition to having the students in person to having to do this on Zoom. And what we started learning there was that when we're facilitating in person, you build up an intuition, right? You can read the room, you can see the energy levels, you can see people's body language, all of these different things. But there's also some things that work better or more efficiently online. So with the Zoom breakout rooms, for example, I could assign students to break out into pairs or groups of 3, etc. And it, you know, takes a couple minutes. If I were doing that in person, right? Like we don't even have these small private areas on campus for students to break off into pairs. And they have to physically move themselves. And that's kind of an even larger disruption. So I think a point to think about here as things are rapidly changing is that when we adopt a new technology, or not that Zoom is that new, right? Teleconference has been around for a long time, but it's kind of at a scale that's very different. Then how can we think about the inherent advantages of that and not just use it to replace something old, right? And we can look at these historical precedents too, like early cinema, where the first movies were essentially just stage plays that were recorded, right? And then it wasn't until decades later of different innovations about editing and moving the camera that cinema really became, really realized some of the potential of the medium. And so coming back to what you're saying about intuition versus being deliberate, teaching in person, if you've been doing it for a while, you pick up some intuitive things that you can do on the fly. But when you're remote first, you need to be more deliberate, right? Because you don't necessarily know. You've probably been in a video conference where like people are speaking over each other because you can't quite read who's leaning in all the time. So thinking about, okay, well, do we call on each other? Do we have some sort of process also for creativity, right? If you're a solo designer or creative person, you've probably internalized and have this sort of intuitive thing. You know when the painting is done, or you know when the product is done. But when you're in a team environment, especially a distributed team environment, then you have to have a process that design thinking can give you of like, okay, in this meeting, we want to go wide with our divergent thinking. We want to brainstorm lots of new ideas, and maybe in a different meeting, we'll actually narrow it down and decide. But if you're trying to do both at once, you can kind of get out of sync or you get stuck. So how do we kind of sequence things in different ways and make that more deliberative versus something that's kind of more arbitrary and intuitive, because that doesn't really work when we're distributed like this.
That's very interesting in terms of how you can. I can also see how I have changed how I do presentations and the focus on content, and how it is slower, but it's also a very different type of interaction. And I think that's also some of how we're trying to understand the new medium that we're really dealing with when we're working online, and the different interactions. Um, and how does we've I'm always talking about empathy, and I know that empathy plays very much into design thinking. um I always have to bring up empathy because it is so important, and I think it does lend so much to understanding how we ourselves work, and how we can work best with others, and understanding how others are working. So how do you see that empathy plays into design thinking, and how to approach ways of working, and working with others in a team situation, for example, within your organization?
Yeah. Well, certainly the COVID situation has changed the way that we do design research, right? The the sort of best practices before this has been to go where people are, where your customers are, see where they work, where they live, where they play, observe and interview them there in that context, right? And I'm really borrowing from and working with folks like anthropologists who have deep expertise in that. But now, because we can't go there, I think there's an extra need to how do you connect, right? When you're just a figure in a rectangle on a screen, connecting with another figure on a rectangle on a screen. But I'm seeing this new cultural norm emerge across organizations where you sign into a Zoom meeting early, or you're waiting for some stragglers, and you have the small talk, right, that you might have in a in-person conference room. But now even like how are you doing has a new valence to it, right? It's a very loaded kind of question, and you're seeing now people being more vulnerable and opening up about this stuff. Plus, you're getting a sneak peek into their domestic spaces, right, with their kids and their pets and things like that. So I think while we can't physically connect with people, I think it's changing some of the norms of like what is professional, what is personal, and how do we empathize with our coworkers and with other people that we're on video conference with.
Yes, it's interesting that you say that. I saw a post. Somebody had commented on an article that I'd written about empathetic leadership, and he was saying how honored he was as the CEO of the company to be invited in to people's homes. And that was a lovely way to put it, I thought. But it is because so interesting, and it is so much more personal and intimate when you understand that you are seeing into somebody's world. And I am always paying attention when I see the background, and sometimes I put particular backgrounds up. This is actually a real wall, but somebody just asked me, actually, is that a real wall? I said, well, I actually do have a wall backdrop, but this is actually a real one. So it's like, how does that make us change how we need to be thinking about how we're interacting, and what kind of, when we put on our design thinking hat, um and sort of infusing our new ways of thinking with empathy, and moving forward in a very different way. What can we be doing differently? Again, just thinking about, you going back to your when you made a comment about incremental change that people can do. What could somebody who maybe has a small business, in New York, or anywhere else, and they're trying to work out how to think about how they can move forward and deal with the types of uncertainty that we are seeing. What are some of the incremental ways that they can look at different aspects of their business to make changes that could help them get through the months ahead?
Yeah. That's a really great question. I think a lot of it is obviously specific to different industries and different organizations. But at FUSA, we use this term, this minimum unit of engagement, right? Which is kind of a play on the minimum viable product idea of like, what is the smallest thing or the cheapest thing that you could possibly build just to learn from potential customers or real customers. And with the minimum unit of engagement, we're really thinking about what is the smallest thing that you could do. So if you were a retail business, right, is how do you change that usually it's that minimum unit of engagement is somebody buying something from your shop, right? And if it's something else, maybe you change it to doing something on Instagram or some other social platform. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that's monetized or converts, but in some ways that shift is already going from like, okay, you are primarily a retail business to you are a de facto media business or media platform in that sense, and you're still engaging people and then hopefully getting them through the marketing ladder, right? So, or the marketing funnel. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is, again, these small bets doesn't necessarily, you're not necessarily going to come up with a brand new business model overnight. But there are other small things that you can do of like, okay, you're a small business and you depended on people walking by most of the time. Does that mean kind of taking a small step into social media, or is it a small step into online ads that reach an audience outside of your geography? So these kind of little things, and thinking about, okay, what are the small bets that you can make, and what can you learn from that? And then also in your own routines as well, right? As I mentioned with my students, are there things that you can do, especially since our routines have been disrupted for months now. So how can you change the input side of things? A lot of innovation is just looking at other patterns, looking at what works in other fields. And so how do we diversify, I guess, that intake part of our media diet or social media diet, those things as well, to increase the chances of finding that inspiration and finding that thing that works.
I love that. I think, and it's very interesting to me as you talk about breaking things down and really helping me sort of notice and think about the different things that I do and how that I do them. And, I actually was away for 2 months, came back and sort of reset up completely new habits in order to sort of kind of go, okay, so what are we dealing with now? What's this new phase? And then, what can I do then? And I was at a co-working space. I was at Neuhaus before. It's not open again. So what does that mean? What am I anticipating, thinking about? But it really just sort of you start breaking down all the different pieces and thinking about them separately, and all the different pieces of the business. For people who do have, expansive thinking, they sort of think laterally and they can sort of bounce ideas off themselves, so to speak. What do you suggest for people who that isn't necessarily their forte, but they might be a solopreneur or have a small business? What are the best things for them? Or if you're sort of working in a team and trying to bring new ideas to interject, is it, would you suggest that people to get together with a bunch of friends, or just try and, how can you come up with some new solutions and suggestions if design thinking is not your thing? What are some of the steps that you can take in a sort of, perhaps in a a logical progression to help create, bring up, give rise to that innovation that people need to bring to thinking about things in a very, very different world?
Yeah, I think it's recognizing that ideas are relatively cheap, right? And to be less precious about them. So obviously there's specific tactics that could work for different people and for different teams, right? Getting a design thinking coach or somebody external to come in often can help, right? Because they inject some new cultural DNA into your team. But if that's not possible, thinking about how do you cross-pollinate in different ways, or how do you increase the diversity in your team in different ways? And also thinking about, again, this mindset of design thinking that is a dynamic one. So oftentimes people fall on some spectrum between a yes and a no but, right? And stereotypically, people from different professional backgrounds lean more towards one or the other. So, if you're a lawyer, not to pick on lawyers, but they often fall more on the no but side of things because they are trained to manage and try to minimize risk and exposure, right? But when you're trying to innovate, you do have to sort of take these risks and also take some time exploring the preposterous, because that can help us come back to something that will work. So there's a story that's almost entered the realm of myth. I've tried to fact check this, and it's inconclusive. But basically, years ago, there was a utility company on the West Coast, and they were having trouble in the wintertime with snow and ice on the electrical lines. And they used to have to send guys to basically like clean off the ice, right, to make sure that their customers' electricity doesn't get cut off. And this was expensive. It was dangerous. They brought in consultants to bring in different people in the organization to talk about it. And in one of the workshops, they were still talking in circles, and they broke for lunch. One of the consultants sat at a table next to some guys whose job it is to do this kind of physical maintenance work, and they were reminiscing about the time they were like out in the woods trying to fix one of the lines, and they encountered a bear. And so this kind of set the consultant on this whole flight of fancy when they reconvened the workshop of like, just kind of almost throwing in this wild card of like, oh, well, what if we put honey on the electrical lines and then trained bears to lick the honey and the ice off, and something completely absurd, right? But that sparked in somebody else in the team of like, okay, well, how are we going to put the honey on the lines? And then somebody else said helicopter, and then it all kind of clicked of like, oh, we can just use the downdraft from the helicopter to blow off the snow and ice, and we don't have to send guys up there, right? And obviously these things are sort of obvious in retrospect, but it took this whole bear and honey thing to get to the helicopters because people weren't connecting the dots, right? And so you sometimes have to just go beyond and just give some time and space for these kind of absurd flights of fancies to come back to something that might actually work.
Oh my goodness. I absolutely love that story about the bear and the honey. And I think it's so important to be able to have some of those crazy ideas. I do believe, there's the science of inclusion and cognitive diversity really, really helps people, helps innovation and creativity, because they're just, people can bring ideas from every single corner. And allowing for that safety and being able to create that safe space so that people can throw in the crazy idea. I mean, that wasn't even trying to be an idea. It was potentially a little bit facetious, I'm guessing.
Right.
Like, yeah, okay, let's get this, bear to help. How do you allow in an organization? Obviously, it's can be easier when you bring in a design consultant to sort of help people have come up with those crazy ideas. But if you're an organization, right now, and trying to come up with all kinds of ideas that might spark really practical ideas, how do you help create that safe space, or how can somebody try and create that safe space within their organization to be able to spark a really positive and wide-reaching brainstorming session?
Yeah. So there's some specific tactics that I would suggest. One is that for a lot of organizational cultures where people are socialized to be problem solvers, right? They want to rush to solve the problem and kind of be the first one there with the big idea, that you need to change some of the incentives, even if it's in a micro sense, right? So in a meeting, rather than saying like, okay, well, we're not leaving this room or this Zoom until we have something viable, changing it up. Like I hate this term gamify, but basically changing the incentives, right? So saying like, okay, can we come up with 100 ideas, or come up with 10 of the worst ideas first? And in some ways it breaks the ice, or just kind of gets it out of the system, right? Of like, okay, people can be creative. They can say stuff that will definitively not work to just kind of clear the air. Because I think for any creative person, the blank sheet of paper, the blank canvas can be really hard to deal with. So thinking about, okay, well, if you've at least got your bad ideas on the table and things that definitely don't work, it's no longer an empty canvas, right? There's still something on there that you can sort of jump off of, just like the bear and honey example. So yeah, I think going to quantity versus like quality, especially in the early stages, but also bringing in different voices to the table, right? Cross-pollinating across the organization, different job roles, and everybody will bring a different perspective in that sense. And also blur hierarchy. So what we were doing in our in-person workshops before the COVID shutdown was we would often assign nicknames to our workshop participants. Sometimes we would know, like, who's the boss because they hired us. But we often didn't do introductions of who was who else in these workshops until the very end. And we just assigned people these arbitrary nicknames, right? Of like, Honey Bear and Frogger or whatever these things were, just because it was a way of like changing people's identities and, at least as outsiders, being able to disrupt some of these traditional hierarchies.
That's a very interesting point in terms of allowing people to have different roles, and therefore they can feel more comfortable to share different ideas. I also love the idea of the worst 100 ideas first, because then even one of those might be a good idea, but people sort of have the freedom to share anything that's on their mind. This is very interesting in terms of also the cross functionality and bringing, sort of helping force the conversation between people with very different perspectives, and enabling people from very different disciplines to share ideas, to bring ideas to the table. How do you find that the conversation? I can imagine it can be challenging sometimes. People bring very, very different ideas to the table, and they don't necessarily sort of understand or see what the other person's talking about. I mean, people can talk across each other,
Mm-hmm.
and in particularly when there's sort of no but type.
Yeah.
There can be some of that atmosphere. How do you help them see the other people's perspectives when you're trying to really expand people's point, the ideas that could be contemplated and new solutions found?
Yeah. So my friend and colleague Tracy Brandenburg, who is an anthropologist by training but has taught design thinking at Cornell and at Stanford, she taught me this kind of point of advice, that the person who brings the prototype to the table or to the meeting has a winning advantage, right? And the idea goes back to this classic maxim of show, don't tell, right? So when we're thinking about an idea, we can communicate an idea in different ways, and different organizations and teams value different forms of communication, right? Sometimes it's the written word, other times it's people who are elegant verbally, right, in terms of their speech, eloquent in that sense. And part of the design thinking ethos is having making be a part of that. And you don't necessarily have to be a skilled craftsperson or a kind of graphics person to do this. I've shown examples to my students where I basically just draw on cocktail napkins and Post-it notes to create some sort of storyboard, right? And thinking about when you have an idea and it's fleshed out enough that you want to explore it some more, then think about the idea in the context of a story, of how does it fit into your customer's life, or if it's an internal idea, how does it change your team's daily practices and routines? And then can you communicate it in the form of a story? Because we're also hardwired as humans to think in terms of stories and to use stories as our entry point to understand these complex systems. And then this is where you can start get the stress testing of like, oh, the what if this happens, then something else, or somebody has to do it this way to make this work. But you need the story, and it's not just about, to pick on Apple, where they like have the new product, but it's on like an all white or an all black background. Right. And it works for them because we've been primed with their branding. But for the most part, you want to see whatever new product, service, or policy in some sort of story form, so it can really come to life for us. And it's not just like, here's the thing in a PowerPoint.
That really does help in terms of sort of understanding the setting. And then do you create multiple stories to be able to think through how a customer, like, there are multiple sort of customer profiles, I guess, in terms of trying to understand how that service, the product or service, might be used by in different ways by different people. I guess you're sort of exploring different storylines in that person's life, or how other people may be using it. Is that sort of how you then go from the brainstorming session to exploring and sort of trialing and testing whether a new idea could work?
Yeah, and I think now we're getting into the territory of service design, which borrows from some of these metaphors of theater or cinema, right? So you can think about people, and then there's the props, which could be like your app, your gadget, whatever you're introducing into your system. And then there's also like processes, which are kind of like the scripts, or the if then and then that kinds of things, right? So once you introduce that, you can map out these different elements in different ways. And as you were saying, Sophie, you could have the perspective of a customer. So say it's a new banking experience. So what is the customer view of this? But then what does the teller or the online banker, what is their view of things? What technology, what props do you need for them to enable the tasks that they need to do? What processes, what policies do you need to have in place for this to all work together? So this is thinking about it in systems, but when we have timelines and points of view, it keeps things grounded in the human, right? Because even if we need silos for efficiency and for managing complexity, these stories help us break through these silos and saying like, okay, well, as a customer, I kind of demand and want a consistent banking experience, whether I'm at the ATM or in the branch when the branch reopens, as I'm online. And even if these are run by different departments, different silos, my perspective of them is still the same for the bank, right? So how do we make these more seamless, or something that makes sense from my perspective, and then also look at the perspective of like the teller and the other people who are actually delivering the service?
That makes a ton of sense. And you raised something which I am always very interested in, which is systems theory, and which I didn't realize how young it is. I mean, we actually started understanding that the whole, ecosystems are all interrelated in the 1970s, which seems like ridiculously recent in my perspective. In this situation, it seems that we have, and an opportunity, as we were talking about at the very beginning, because it seems so that so many elements of the system has changed, and which is fascinating to me, very disruptive, very challenging. And how, what are some of the things that you, maybe from a design perspective, some of the things that you are sort of excited about that you've been seeing around in terms of how things are really changing? Like how many, I don't know, are we really going to see banks so much? I mean, I think this is pushing much more for the online banks. And one of the things that's been, very interesting to me is that, for example, I didn't use much cash before. Now I hardly ever use cash because, of course, it could be contagious. So, this is, cash is something, something that's really going to be going out of the most part, out of our lives, because of what it means to be handing pieces of paper over, or coins that could be transmitting disease. So what are some of the exciting or very new and innovative newly designed products or services that you have been seeing or hearing about?
Yeah. Same for me with the cash situation, by the way. I think it had been 3 months since I used cash, and I needed to tip a parking attendant because there was no other option but valet when I was going somewhere. And I was like, oh, wow, this is weird to have this piece of paper in my hand. But I think a lot of these COVID-based disruptions have just accelerated things that were already in the works, right? There was already a push for cashless transactions, and obviously there are accessibility and equity issues there, right? In terms of people who are unbanked and all of these sort of things that we need to take into account, and certainly with remote work as well, right? Of like, what sort of access do people have to internet connections and all of these sort of things. That being said, I think less so than like specific apps or technologies or things like that, because a lot of this has kind of already been in the works. I'm interested in how these sort of behaviors and policies and cultural norms in the macro sense have shifted overnight, right? So even though, for example, when Andrew Yang was still a presidential candidate, was talking about universal basic income, but I think that plus the COVID crisis has mainstreamed things like that. Or we have the Prime Minister of New Zealand talking about adopting a 4-day work week as a way of helping with recovery, right? And making sure that jobs get distributed around in different ways. So things like that were almost utopian in thinking are now on the table at that sort of political and the systems level. And then I think coming back to the micro level, I think that is inspiration for changing the way that we do business.
I hadn't heard that about the 4-day week in New Zealand, and I think she is the prime minister there is seems to be an extraordinarily competent and thoughtful woman, and I really much like the idea of that because I think one of the challenges I interviewed Gary Bowles, who is the chair of the future of work for the future of work at Singularity University, and he was talking about the Great Reset and how some of the things that really will be necessary to change before we can really come out of this extraordinary economic disruption and what it's done to jobs and the length of time that so many of the jobs are going to take to come back because customer behavior has changed in so many different ways. And I think that's also one thing that can be challenging for businesses is to understand, because I recognize that some of my behaviors have changed and will continue to stay probably changed for a while. So trying to sort of understand what we can do and how we can move forward, and make changes that are going to be the most productive for the new normal. And what does that new normal look like? How do you look towards a new normal with a design thinking hat when we don't know what it's going to look like? How can you sort of project? Is it sort of, this is what would be the best new normal, or how do you approach that?
Yeah. Again, we're not able to look into the crystal ball in this sense and predict things. But I think the starting point for design thinking or human-centered design, whatever you want to call it, is thinking about what human needs and motivations are. And there are things that we do know regardless of how this pandemic is going to play out in terms of vaccine or no vaccine or timeline of all of those things. And I think a real big one and an opportunity area is around trust, right? So it's not going to be like turning on and turning off a light switch. Like I think the shutdowns were relatively quick, right? Because it came through legal mandates of like, okay, you have to shut down the school, you have to shut down your non-essential business. But when we're opening back up, and I think we've seen these struggles, right, in states that have opened up earlier, is that you can't just flip the switch. And so even talking with family members and with friend groups about like, okay, what is our quarantine pod going to look like, right? Of like, okay, we don't feel like we all need to stay home all the time, but if we open it up to a smaller circle of people, how do you do that? How do you maintain that trust? How do you communicate in different ways? And we don't necessarily have, this is kind of very new behavior for most of us to navigate. So what are tools to enable those sort of activities, and how do we look at trust in those sort of ways? And then you can apply trust to other things, right? Whether it's commercial transactions or for workplaces that do have to open up in some ways, right? Like what are these different pods going to be looking like, and what are these sort of socially distanced workplaces? So I think there's something there, and we haven't quite figured out what that looks like.
It's very interesting you say that about trust, because we haven't really focused on trust-based relationships. I've been talking about them, to do with empathy, and we've talked before about trust needing in terms of safe spaces and belonging and those type of things. But really, you're hitting a really important nail on the head in terms of how we're trusting each other. Because I remember certainly March, April, you'd see somebody walking in the street when you're going to the grocery store, and you'd shy away, and and now you have the mask on, and there's much more comfort and about the fact that people are being safe and trying to act in ways that are that both people feel that there's a sense of trust, a reciprocal sense of trust. But also when somebody isn't behaving in a way that you feel that they're keeping you safe and they're being thoughtful about not just yourself but others, and how do we recreate that? I do see that now there's more people looking in the street at other people and sort of smiling. There's more sense of we're in this together, we're getting through it. But I think when there is quite a lot of there's a lot of fear around, there's a lot of concern around, and people are not feeling comfortable and grounded. So how can we be building that trust and in different ways. I think that's a really interesting design challenge, and for people trying to work out how to bring people back to the workplace, and how to connect also with their team members. Are there particular things that you have done yourself in helping try and innovate for trust within organizations?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a tough one. I think for the most part, there's no sort of like killer app for this sort of thing. A lot of it is looking at systems. So, I mean, this is a pre-COVID example, but we worked with an international organization a few years ago that was less about trust and more about information sharing, right? And so the focus of the project was a new intranet that would allow people who worked in different offices to upload information that could be shared with folks in headquarters and other regional offices. And what we found was that, like, yes, the tech needed to be updated because they just had some obsolete technology that was hard to use. But then there were things that were like out of our purview that we would want to design for if we had the opportunity, or suggest that they design for. So just things like, okay, well, how do you expect people to upload stuff, even if you give them a guidebook of what you should share, but if it's not part of their performance reviews, like, why should they, except if they want to, right? Or if people in this particular environment, they didn't really have an office space that was even conducive to the kind of coffee break talk, because they didn't have that there. And so if people weren't even in the same office, weren't even communicating in these informal ways, how do you expect them to kind of all of a sudden communicate in this sort of more formalized online space? So I think there's a lot of things there that require us to think in terms of a system, right? And even these apps, right, that are the centerpiece of something, whether it's like a rideshare app or like an Airbnb kind of app, it's the technology is a big part of it, but then there's this whole other thing you have to do in terms of like, how do you build trust? How do you build a community as well? And so those are different kinds of functions that are more like tending a garden of a community, rather than like just kind of shipping product and product releases.
That's a very interesting point in terms of, again, going back to some of those incremental pieces. I'm really noticing how your design thinking comes in to think about different aspects of the process. It wouldn't have occurred to me to think about all those different elements and what that meant in terms of what they should or shouldn't do. But of course, if someone doesn't pay attention or read the manual, I'm not sure I read too many manuals.
Yeah.
What is that? How do other people interpret that? And I'm not necessarily assuming that they are interpreting that in a certain way, but some people may be, and therefore all of those things need to be thought through. And I interviewed Heidi Mellon from Workfront, and she was talking about sort of workflow through the organization, understanding that. And it was, all these pieces really show me about how we need to be thinking about, as we're redesigning, as we're rethinking and reconfiguring how we work and how we work with other people, and who's doing what and when they need to do it, as we explore just reconfiguring the same business model or tweaking it, or changing it, all the different pieces that need to be thought through, and how people are interacting, as well as delivering the product to the customer. It's really fascinating. We're coming to the end, and I always love to give a moment, LaShawn. This has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it. What tip that can you give to anybody who's watching now or in the future, because this recording is going to be available, in terms of how they can be thinking tomorrow or this afternoon about how to use design thinking and apply it to their particular business or project or task, or how they work?
Yeah. I think I'd like to just sum up some of the main points that I've already made, and maybe there's something new here as well. But one is just small bets, right? So thinking about what are these small things that you can do. Also thinking about being iterative of, this is meant to be data driven. This is meant to be something that you can measure and then tweak. Also think about, how do you absorb diverse ideas, diverse viewpoints, that can mean diversifying your team, but also what you're reading, what you're consuming in those sort of inputs. And then also embrace those bad ideas, right? So a lot of personal creative journey work is around journaling or some other kind of documentation of like just collect the bad ideas, because you never know when you'll find like the bear and honey to the helicopter kind of pivot. So think about that too, and have that, you don't have to share it around, but that becomes part of your toolkit or your playbook of things that you can always pull out when you need to, even if it doesn't seem immediately obvious what the application is.
Well, Sean, those were fantastic tips to finish off with. I really, really appreciate it. I will forever be thinking about bears and honey and snow on the West Coast. It's been incredibly useful to hear how design thinking can help as we try and navigate these challenging times, and how we can be thinking about the small things and the big things, and be moving forward in different and similar ways, but more productive ways, and be able to emerge stronger in the future. So thank you so much for your time, LaShawn. Really, really appreciate it. And just after this, there'll be a slide to show how you can follow LaShawn on Twitter, and as well Fusa, which is his design venture. So thank you again, LaShawn.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks for tuning in, everyone.